Today, Entangled Life. I read this yesterday, and yeah, I mean, I definitely enjoy this book. I have a friend who's reading it right now, who is not liking it. He's not liking it at all, and it's because he was expecting a better writing. That's what he says. He expected. I think the book is quite it's actually well written. I enjoyed reading it. It's definitely better written than I can write. So that's all I ask for. This guy's brother, he read it a while ago, and he's the one who made me wanna read it because I was trapped with him for a whole week hiking in Yorkshire in winter. I don't know why, and and he only talked about this because that guy doesn't normally read, and when he read this, it was like a huge thing, you know. And yeah, I was just listening about. So basically, this wasn't like fully new to me. I knew a lot about the book going into it, but I enjoyed it a lot. And I was reading this because there's supposed to be some kind of like science event going on in June, reading booktube. I think I heard someone say it, I don't remember, but it was like, okay, let's pick up one of those science books that I've been meaning to read forever. And this is the one that I've been meaning to read for the longest, that I haven't read. So there we are. This is more than a narrative. This is like a meta-narrative. This is like, it's a very grand project. Because fungi are a very special form of life. And the first job that the writer has is to remove all the possible prejudices that we could have about fungi. Because they haven't, I mean, now they are a part of the fashion. They're very popular now. But before this book was written, and except for certain sort of like psychedelic drug groups, fungi, and especially mushrooms, were not as famous, as talked about, as explored. You know, there's many pop science books. There were many pop science books about plants, about any kind of animal that you could think of. Not so much about fungi. Mushrooms definitely get a bit more attention, but our perspective on mushrooms is also quite narrow because we don't, like, most people is not even aware that the mushrooms are just the fruit of a being, a life form that is under the soil and that extends for kilometers. That the mushroom is not a thing in itself, exactly. So yeah, like this is like so much interesting stuff here, and that's why I read it so fast. Like, the writing is okay, but the things that are said here are very interesting. And something I really like from Merlin Sheldrake is that he also understands that science, like history and like every other discipline that pretends to be objective, is just a story, is just a narrative. It can be told through different perspectives, and it is subject to be like any scientific perspective is also a political perspective, is also a perspective on like the author. Darwin is a good example of that. We talked about Sex at Dawn and how Darwin's own sexual repression affected the way he the way he made his observations, right? So this guy is aware of that, and because of that, this book is incredibly playful. Supposed to be a pop science book. As I read it, it didn't feel like that. It felt almost like a scientific philosophical book, because there are parts here where he talks about his LSD trip. He talks about certain like mushroom religions. He tries to do some anthropology. Obviously, there's always, in any pop science book, there's always going to be a chapter on ecology, on what does this life form, in which way does it contribute to a greater whole, to the symbiotic relationship that we should be having with the earth, right? So yeah, that's it. The reason why mushrooms haven't had as much attention, or didn't have as much attention before, it's because they are probably the greatest other in the natural world. They're like complete otherness. We don't have as much contact with them as with other beings, and therefore we never got around to establish a relationship with them that wasn't just instrumental, and to study them is less. It used to be less thinkable. But those who interacted with them tended to mystify them, because mushrooms have effects on the human body when they are taken, and that plus how strange they are and how everywhere they are didn't help to reduce that level of mystification. And yeah, so let's see what we can say here. The main like the main narrative, like the main purpose of this book is just to make us aware of how they truly how truly they make our worlds and change our minds. They are inside and outside of us. They are the beginning and the end of life. And I think that was definitely achieved successfully. The most dancing relationship that you as a living entity and as a human have is with fungi. It's yeast. Yeast is being part of our bodies since the beginning of since we have bodies. Yeah, and there are so many forms of fungi that we cannot even define it. Lichens, the part on lichens was for me super interesting, because they seem to be so rich, so complex, and yet so basic that scholars who study lichens don't seem to really know how to define them, because as you keep breaking them down, normally when you wanna study something, you as a, like scientists break down the thing that they're studying in parts, and then take those parts and see what's fundamental to create like a whole. But lichens are pretty much infinitely divisible, and they are very simple, because they are, as I said, they are the beginning of life. Like if you have if a volcano erupts in an island, and it kills all forms of life and destroys the soil, then the first thing that you will get is lichens on the rocks. That will be the first life form that you will get. This lichen will fall off the rocks and start generating soil. In that soil, humidity will accumulate and fungi will appear. And then the seeds that fall from birds, flying birds, things like that, will start to germinate, and life will be back on the island. It starts with lichens. And of course, when you die, and while you're alive, fungi assimilate pretty much every nutrient. They just like they play a huge role on keeping you alive and on maintaining you. When I talked about Symbiotic Planet, I think I also said that, you know, many times we have parasites and microbes that are we call them parasites, but we couldn't live without them. And we've already observed instances of parasites that save their host. That some insects have been saved in climate change and situations like that, because a parasite inside them didn't want them to die in order to be able to survive. So there are many different kinds of relationships. This book is very careful in not only talking about the positive relationships that we have with fungi. They can also be deadly. Not only to the world and to other animals, but also to us. there's this fungi that gets into, like, I think it's a grasshopper's head or termite, I don't remember, but it gets into, like, it gets inside an insect, and it manipulates the insect. And at the beginning they would be like, oh yeah, so once the fungi enters the body of this insect, the insect modifies its behavior. So it's the insect that's modifying the behavior. But the more they saw what the insect was saying, the more they realize that the insect doesn't modify any behavior. The behavior becomes the fungi's behavior. The insect stops doing what the insect normally does, and only really focuses on doing that which the fungi could be wanting to do. So it's basically a fungi on insects' clothes. It's like accustomed to it. That you could probably that inspired Last of Us and some zombie fictions. And that's another thing that is talked about here, is how, you know, like, fictions and reality are intertwined, and how they influence each other reciprocally. Do you say reciprocally? It's a question for later. So yeah, I mean, on lichens, there's a nice quote here. It says, lichens are places where lichens are places where an organism unravels into an ecosystem, and where an ecosystem congeals into an organism. They flicker between wholes and collections of parts. Settling between the two perspectives is a confusing experience. The word individual comes from the Latin meaning undividable. Is the whole lichen the individual, or are its constituent members, the parts, the individuals? Is this even the right question to ask? Lichens are a product less of their parts than of the changes between those parts. Lichens are established networks of relationships. They never stop lichenizing. They are verbs as well as nouns. And I don't know, I just found it fascinating how something so simple, I would even assume one of the simplest forms of life, is actually incredibly complex and hard to define. Yeah, that was definitely surprising to me. And I knew more about mycelium and how it expands through like, basically, you could say that the biggest organism alive is a fungi, you know, and it's I think it's in Japan that is the biggest found. But basically, like, it's a net of connection of the fungi that's basically like all under the forest, but it's all one thing, and it has intelligence. There was this scientist, I don't remember, somewhere in the book, that did this experiment. He always got lost in IKEA, so he created a model of IKEA, and put the fungi on the middle. I think the fungi he put was the mycorrhizal mycorrhizal fungi, I think. Don't take my word on that, but yeah, basically he put it in the middle of this labyrinth that he created, this IKEA labyrinth, and the fungi not only found a way out by expanding towards that way because he put something outside of IKEA that would attract it, but it found the quickest way out. And there's been like other experiments like that. So they have problem-solving skills. They have a form of intelligence, but because of our anthropocentric way of thinking of intelligence as brain-based, we've taken a long time to realize that there are forms of intelligence that can be as complex or even more complex. In this case, it might be more complex. You know, it might be way more complex than ours. That just because they are not part of a brain, because they're not contained within a brain, somehow we just don't consider it. You know, we use ourselves as the measure of all things, and and that means that we leave out a lot of interesting life forms that we could learn about immensely. So yeah, that's that's a thing to think about as well. There's a part where he talks about, you know, with because this sort of like these connections that are created on the forest is called the Wood Wide Web, and he compares it with the World Wide Web, with the internet, and how neither the scientists that study the internet or those who study the Wood Wide Web really understand what's going on in there, because first of all, and that's another reflection that I loved from this book, and I haven't seen it enough in enough scientific books, is the idea that the observer modifies the subject that is observing. And in the case of biologists, he would say, at some point, I would say found it, because it was really beautiful the way he wrote it. But he was basically commenting how, in order to study those connections, biologists often destroy the organism they hope to understand. I've spent days doing it, and days thinking about the irony of cutting the very connections that I was studying. I was used to this idea as much as it's possible to get used to it, but severing the connections in a network to study a network felt unusually absurd. And he just keeps going, but the point is that the way we do science, the way we just break down the things that we're studying, conditions the results that we're gonna get. And one of the things that, so then they had this idea of studying like the responses and everything in there without breaking them down, which it's funny that is the second option rather than the first one. But yeah, like once they started studying the behavior and within the Wood Wide Web, that's sort of like sustained through the fungi that allows for that net of information to be transported. It's everything is conducted through the fungi basically. When a tree is cutted, you know, the tree sends a response to other trees, and they wonder whether what they are sending is like whether what the tree is sending is just a scream, in the sense of just a response to the suffering, or is a warning for other trees, right? Because it would be a very different because it would be a very different thing to say that the tree responds to being gutted by emitting a sound that really has no purpose or direction, versus saying that the tree is trying to warn its neighboring trees. Obviously, the result of this tree sending the synapse, the message to other trees, is that the other trees get ready and prepare themselves physiologically to deal with whatever that threat is. And you know, there's like Toby Kyers, for example. One scientist says, if a tree gets attacked by an insect, then of course it's going to scream in its language. It will produce some sort of chemical to get ready for the attack. Obviously, Merlin Sheldrake is not necessarily skeptical to this claim, but he considers the possibility that the tree might also just be actually warning its other tree friends or tree neighbors or whatever. But I just don't think that is the case. I think, like, as I was reading that, I think, like, because they were using analogy with humans, right? Like, if someone stops in the street and is trying to like rob you and they attack you and you scream, are you screaming to warn someone else, or are you screaming to just because it's a response out of the fear that you feel? I think it's always I think, I mean, we are social beings, and I think our response is to scream precisely because by like we are conditioned to know that we will get a response of some kind by someone. Like if there is anyone around, I think it's a call for help in every case. That's what I'm trying to say. You don't need to, because if it were a response to pain, then we would always scream when we feel pain, but we don't. We only scream in very specific situations, and not even everyone does. So I think screaming, or in this case sending the message, for me, obviously with this absurd parallel and comparison with what a human does when it is feel threatened, is a message with a purpose, the purpose of like warning the other trees. And there is many other situations among trees that show that there is such a thing as relations between them and constant communication. And like when a tree, when the seed of that one tree drop next to it germinates, and there is like a small tree, the big tree will send extra nutrients to that new tree that's growing. What's that then? That's clearly another form of interaction that is not necessary for the big tree at all. It doesn't in any way benefit it. Or the other way around is actually against its own interest. So I think that is the same with the warning. I think that message is like, if you get to read this book, if you get around to read this book and you get to that passage, tell me what you think. But for me, it's clearly a warning of a potential threat to other trees, not just a mechanic response that it generates while it's preparing for its own demise. Yeah, so that's it. Then there was this other part of the book that I was more skeptical with, and that I'm obviously that Merlin Sheldrake is clearly biased towards mushrooms, like he's for mushrooms in every sense. So he gives a voice in this book to like Terence McKenna and to like many different mystifications of fungi, and those are parts where like he didn't feel so scientific. He was just more reflective. He did not offer an answer. He was just presenting questions, and I think that was a good approach, a good way of doing this. But he definitely gave more of a voice to those who to like certain theories. Like for example, Terence McKenna believes that our intelligence started developing thanks to mushrooms, and mushrooms gave us intelligence basically through psychedelic experiences, or to people who deifies a certain mushroom. And it's just important to be aware of that. This book is not just a science book. It has scientific stuff in it, but it's not fully objective. It doesn't feel, because, and this I see this in many so-called science books, scientific books, that are scientific in what they are presenting, but they are sometimes omitting convenient things to omit in order to defend the thesis that they want to defend. In this case, this book is trying to, there's a moment when it divides between mycophilic and mycophobic people. I think it's the word is very descriptive. Myco, mushroom, philic, love, phobic, hate, more or less. So between people who has like hatred towards mushrooms or fungi, and people who has the opposite. And he will put like a Terence McKenna in one side, and maybe, I don't know, Ronald Reagan on the other. And he is definitely not telling you, he's not attacking the mycophobic people, and he's not advocating explicitly for the mycophilic people, but this book is definitely, if this book is trying to end any bias, any prejudice against mushrooms, is those biases and prejudices of the mycophobic people. So it's oriented in that direction. He's clearly a mushroom lover, and and in some parts I would have liked a bit more skepticism when it comes to its own scientific input when talking about this these crazy theories. Similarly, when it goes into, you know, the mycorrhizal fungi that seems to be a cure to certain mental diseases, psilocybin as well. You know, there is this, for example, that smokers, like a number, like I don't remember exactly the numbers, but basically it seemed to be a way, like a gateway to end the addictions of other drugs, right? So if you take a single, the point was a single psilocybin experience could end tobacco addiction or something like that. And that's not the only benefit. There's also benefits for depression. There's benefits in multiple areas of addictions and psychological disorders. And there's a lot of emphasis in how mushrooms are biologically harmless, which is true. They are biologically harmless, but I missed as well there some reflection. And so first of all, I don't remember reading anything about how they are psychologically harmful, potentially. People with, I think this is something that I often miss. I don't see almost anyone talking about it, and when they do, it's always really quick and trying to evade the topic of like what they can do psychologically to you. If you have any tendency on your family or whatever to schizophrenia, to paranoia, to psychosis, then the consumption of and that's something that I mean, like I have tried mushrooms, but I do have those tendencies. I have family that has all sorts of mental disorders, so I think that at least acknowledging that there is that possibility to trigger those things, you know, that yes, if you have depression, maybe it's true that the science, like the evidence shows that they are incredibly likely to help you, right? Or if you are trying to stop smoking tobacco, yes, they have helped a number of people, enough for it to be worth mentioning. In studying and multiple pharmaceutics and scientists are considering to make to systematize this, to send it to, yeah, basically to systematize it. But there is, first, like I think first of all you should make sure that you don't have any of those tendencies. There are other things when it comes to taking psychedelics that should be taken into account. Harmless is not the word I would use, because if you've never had psychedelics and then you just take mushrooms, you're just gonna go fucking crazy, unless you are the opposite of self-aware, unless you're the kind of person that like can be can be like on a completely different universe, and you'd be like as if you were in your sofa because you don't even reflect about what's going on around you, which I don't think someone who would take mushrooms would necessarily be. So I'm just like, I didn't like the way that was portrayed, how it was so much for mushroom intake, and I am for do whatever you want, and I myself have taken and will take in the future. But I think that there is not enough visibility of the possible harms that they do, especially psychologically. Not to mention that I have a philosophical problem with the idea of taking mushrooms in order to end something like tobacco addiction. I'm not gonna talk some because this is because the way they help is psychologically, not physically. You know, there is abstinence symptoms of like people who take opiaceous or heroin or even tobacco that are strong, and ending those abstinence symptoms would be like ideal. If taking mushrooms were to end those abstinence symptoms that make it physically impossible for you to stop taking the drug that you are taking, then I'd be like, oh yeah, it's actually a really good way out to simply take mushrooms and stop those abstinence symptoms, and then stop smoking tobacco eventually. And because they are not addictive and they have shown to be like that. They have shown to be like effective even with a single intake. Why not? You know. I think there are other arguments to take mushrooms that are more interesting, but with this one specifically, I have a problem. Because if it's not about if it's not about reducing the abstinence symptoms, then it's about the trip. Then it's about the psychological things that they do to you. Then it's about you using them as sort of like a ritualistic thing that somehow, like the idea is that, you know, they present you with new ideas or with ideas that you had long known but being ignoring, and because you are into this sort of like state of disinhibition and deep mind activity, you are finally confronted with those ideas and feel ready. I feel like it's a, for me that's a very easy, I don't know. I just find it very not irresponsible. I don't really know which word to use, but there is such a thing as will for anything like this. Self-discipline, call it whatever you want. If you want to stop smoking tobacco, that should be the thing that takes you out, and not you taking some mushrooms so that what they show you what you already knew. I don't know. I feel like we rely way too much on things like this that facilitate things that should not be facilitated. Things that I think it would be much more productive to simply look at what you already know. Because if it's about taking mushrooms for you to realize that the tobacco is bad for you, or that certain drug is bad for you, I mean, like, I don't think anyone needs that. So yeah, I'm just, let's put it lightly, I'm just skeptical of presenting them as a cure for addictions, especially because we're not talking about a cure physiologically, but just psychologically, just making you consider things that you already knew, that you already wanted to stop tobacco. You're like, I can't, and now you have a mushroom that will validate that and be like, no, you can sort of like seed your will, seed your own accountability for your actions to something that will make you trip for a bit, and then you'll be like, yeah, you know, I talked to the mushroom god and told me to stop taking mushrooms. That part, I'm not saying that that's what this book is arguing. I think this book is actually quite neutral, despite what I already said. But I'm saying that it's these are arguments that are presented here by other people, and that are not scrutinized to the degree that I would have scrutinized them, and that I would like to see them criticized sometimes. So yeah, I mean, that's basically it. There's not much else that I would want to say about this book, because I don't want to break it down completely, and I've been already talking for 30 minutes. That's crazy. But if I had to highlight something of this book that I really like, is that idea of like science being just storytelling to a degree. There is a moment here when he is quoting Richard Levitin, and he says that to do the work of science, that it is impossible to do the work of science without using metaphors, given that almost the entire body of modern science is an attempt by human beings. It's an attempt to explain phenomena that cannot be experienced directly by human beings. Metaphors and analogies in turn come laced with human stories and values, meaning that no discussion of scientific ideas is one, this one included, can be free of cultural bias. And there's like it just keeps reflecting about this for the rest of the book in the very end. I really liked it as well to exemplify what it's saying there. They use, for example, an account from Darwin when he was when he was studying orchid flowers, he says like the position of the antennae in this catasetum might be compared with that of a man with his left arm raised and bent so that his hand stands in front of his chest, and with his right arm crossing his body lower down so that the fingers project just beyond his left side. And now to this account, he wonders, Merlin Sheldrake, is Darwin humanizing the flower, or is he being vegetalized by the flower? Is he describing plant features in human terms as a sign of anthropomorphism? But he is also reimagining the male body, including his own, in floral form, suggesting that he is open to exploring the flower's anatomy in its own terms. There's 1,000 things in which you could do science, and we chose to do it in a very specific way. And there's a number of precepts and codes and signs that we use to do that science. But those are just the product of consensus, not of us having access some objective source of knowledge in the universe. And it's very important to know that, because science is being used to please ideologies, to satisfy political campaigns and stuff like that since the beginning of time. And this book is really good at doing science while also being subjective and being aware that it's being subjective in some parts, and allowing you to realize that it's being subjective, and also showing you that all science is to a degree subjective, that objectivity in this sense is no more than consensuated subjectivity of globally agreed narratives. And the last example it gives in the book is the theory of gravity with Newton, when the whole anecdote that we've all been told of the apple falling on his head. There is no evidence that happened, right? And yet we tell that in schools. We tell that story in schools because it's really good to understand gravity. And just like that, in science, we systematically do that. We take stories because they are the best stories we have, and whenever we find a better story, we'll change it. And science is constantly actualizing itself, and that's what makes it so good, because it's at least in theory, it's almost immune to the rigidity of prejudices, but it's just stories. And this is a story that needed to be told. I like this book, and I think I ranted a little bit about some parts in it, but in general I think it's not only a great read, but that's one of those that can definitely expand your cosmology beyond what you already think to know, and to consider, to reconsider some certainties that you might have taken for granted. So yeah, Merlin Sheldrake, Entangled Life. Enjoy if you read it, and let me know what you thought.